Picture this. A nation drowning in chaos, its people fleeing by the millions, its government accused of crimes that shake the conscience of the world. Venezuela, once the wealthiest country in South America, now a symbol of catastrophic collapse. But here's what most people don't realize. This crisis isn't just a Latin American problem. It's reached across borders, penetrated deep into North America, and changed the strategic calculations of both Canada and the United States in ways that most citizens never see. Right now, as you listen to these words, the ripple effects of Venezuela's meltdown are influencing American military policy, reshaping immigration systems, threatening energy security, and even touching the lives of families thousands of miles away from Caracas. This is the untold story of how one nation's collapse became a continental crisis. This is about how Venezuela's nightmare became America's challenge. Let me take you back to understand how we got here. Venezuela wasn't always synonymous with crisis. In the 1970s, Caracas was called the jewel of South America. The country sat atop the world's largest proven oil reserves, even larger than Saudi Arabia's. Money flowed like rivers. Venezuelans traveled abroad freely, invested in property, sent their children to the best universities. The bolivar, their currency, was strong and respected. American oil companies had deep investments there, and the relationship between Washington and Caracas was generally cooperative, even warm at times. But something happened, something that would set the stage for everything that followed. In 1998, a charismatic former military officer named Hugo Chavez won the presidency. Chavez promised a revolution, a complete transformation of Venezuelan society. He called it socialism of the 21st century. At first, high oil prices masked the problems with his policies. He nationalized industries, seized private property, and implemented price controls that economists warned would be disastrous. But the oil money kept flowing, and Chavez's popularity remained high, especially among the poor who benefited from social programs funded by petroleum revenues. The United States watched this transformation with growing concern. Chavez was vocally anti-American, calling President George W. Bush the devil at the United Nations. He aligned himself with Cuba's Fidel Castro, Iran's Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and other leaders antagonistic to Washington. He sold oil at discounted rates to Cuba and other allies, using Venezuela's resources as geopolitical weapons. American military planners began to see Venezuela not as a partner, but as a potential problem, a source of instability in a region the United States had long considered within its sphere of influence. When Chavez died in 2013, his hand-picked successor Nicolas Maduro took power. And this is when everything truly fell apart. Maduro lacked Chavez's charisma and political skill. More importantly, oil prices collapsed. The Venezuelan economy, utterly dependent on petroleum and hollowed out by years of mismanagement, went into freefall. Inflation didn't just rise. It exploded into hyperinflation, reaching rates that economists compare to Weimar Germany or Zimbabwe at their worst. We're talking about inflation rates in the millions of %. A cup of coffee that cost a few bolivars in the morning might cost exponentially more by evening. Supermarket shelves emptied. Hospitals ran out of medicine. The electricity grid failed repeatedly, plunging entire cities into darkness for days. Crime skyrocketed as desperate people fought for survival. The government's response was to crack down brutally on dissent. Security forces fired on protesters. Opposition leaders were jailed or exiled. Democratic institutions were gutted and replaced with loyalist assemblies. Venezuela, once a democracy however flawed, became effectively a dictatorship. And then the exodus began. Venezuelans started leaving by the hundreds of thousands, then by the millions. They walked across borders into Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador. They crowded onto boats, hoping to reach Caribbean islands. They made the dangerous journey north through Central America toward Mexico, and ultimately the United States border. This wasn't just migration. This was a humanitarian catastrophe on a scale the Western Hemisphere hadn't seen in generations. Now let's talk about how this affected the United States, because the impacts have been profound and multifaceted. First, there's the border. American immigration systems were already strained when Venezuelan migrants started arriving in significant numbers. Unlike migrants from the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, Venezuelans couldn't simply be turned back. Venezuela wouldn't take them, and international law provides protections for people fleeing persecution. So Venezuelans began appearing at the southern border, claiming asylum, creating a new challenge for an immigration system not designed to handle such flows. Cities like Miami, which already had a large Cuban exile community, saw an influx of Venezuelans. New York, Houston, and other major metropolitan areas absorbed thousands more. These weren't typically impoverished, uneducated migrants. Many were middle-class professionals, doctors, engineers, teachers, people who had lost everything when their country collapsed. They arrived with skills but also with trauma, with needs for support, with stories of suffering that would break your heart. The numbers are staggering. By 2023, more than 7 million Venezuelans had fled their country. To put that in perspective, that's nearly a quarter of Venezuela's entire population. It's one of the largest displacement crises in the world, comparable to Syria. And while most settled in other Latin American countries, hundreds of thousands made their way to the United States. The political implications in America have been significant. Immigration became an even more contentious issue. Border communities felt overwhelmed. Federal resources were stretched, and politicians from both parties struggled to craft responses that were both humane and practical. But the migration crisis is only one dimension of how Venezuela has affected the United States. Let's talk about energy security, because this might be the most strategically significant impact. Remember, Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves. Under normal circumstances, Venezuela could be producing 3 to 4 million barrels of oil per day. During the crisis, production collapsed to under 500,000 barrels per day at its worst point. That's millions of barrels of oil per day that simply vanished from global markets. Now, you might think that the United States, as a major oil producer itself thanks to the shale revolution, wouldn't care much about Venezuelan oil. But global oil markets are interconnected. When millions of barrels disappear from supply, prices rise everywhere. American consumers feel it at the pump. American businesses that depend on petroleum products see their costs increase. The U.S. economy, despite producing more oil than ever before, remains vulnerable to global price shocks. More strategically, Venezuela's oil didn't just disappear. Some of it went to China, which provided billions in loans to the Maduro regime in exchange for oil shipments. Some went to Russia, which also propped up Maduro with military support and investment. Cuba received Venezuelan oil at steep discounts, essentially a subsidy that kept the Castro regime afloat. From a U.S. military and strategic perspective, this represented a transfer of resources from what should have been a Western Hemisphere partner to America's geopolitical rivals. The U.S. response involved sanctions, waves of them, targeting Venezuelan government officials, state-owned oil company PDVSA, and eventually the entire petroleum sector. The Trump administration imposed some of the toughest sanctions ever placed on an oil-producing nation, essentially trying to cut off Maduro's revenue streams and force him from power through economic pressure. The Biden administration continued most of these sanctions while also trying to engage in dialogue, a delicate balance between pressure and pragmatism. But here's where it gets really interesting from a military and strategic affairs perspective. Venezuela's crisis created a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped actors that concern American military planners deeply. Let's start with Russia. Moscow has been cultivating ties with Caracas for years, seeing Venezuela as a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, right in America's backyard. Russia has sold Venezuela billions of dollars in weapons, everything from fighter jets to missile systems. Russian military advisors have been present in Venezuela, and there have been instances of Russian strategic bombers landing in Venezuela, a provocative gesture clearly meant to signal that Russia can project power into the Caribbean. Then there's China. Beijing's approach has been more economic than military, but no less significant. China has loaned Venezuela over $60 billion, making it one of the largest creditors to the Maduro regime. In exchange, China secured oil supplies and access to Venezuela's other natural resources, including gold and minerals. Chinese companies have invested in Venezuelan infrastructure, telecommunications, and industry. For American strategists, this represents Chinese influence expanding in Latin America, traditionally an area where U.S. influence has been paramount. Cuba's role can't be ignored either. The Castro regime, now led by Miguel Díaz-Canel, sent thousands of intelligence operatives, military advisors, and medical personnel to Venezuela. Many analysts believe these Cubans have been instrumental in helping Maduro maintain control, advising security forces on repression techniques, managing intelligence networks that monitor the opposition. It's a strange reversal. For decades, Cuba depended on Soviet support. When the USSR collapsed, Cuba nearly did too. Then Venezuela under Chavez became Cuba's patron. Now, even as Venezuela collapses, Cuba provides the expertise in authoritarianism that keeps Maduro in power. And then there are the truly troubling elements. Iran has established a presence in Venezuela, with flights between Tehran and Caracas, cooperation on oil and mining, and reports of other activities that concern American intelligence agencies. Hezbollah, the Lebanese militant group backed by Iran, is believed to have operatives and fundraising networks in Venezuela and the broader region. Venezuelan passports and identification documents have reportedly been sold or provided to individuals with no legitimate claim to them, raising terrorism concerns. The drug trade represents another dimension of this crisis that directly affects American security. Venezuela shares a long border with Colombia, the world's largest cocaine producer. As Venezuelan state institutions collapsed, drug trafficking organizations moved in. The porous border became a highway for cocaine heading north toward the United States. Some Venezuelan military and government officials have been accused by U.S. authorities of direct involvement in drug trafficking, turning the Venezuelan state into what some call a narco-state. In 2020, the U.S. Department of Justice indicted Nicolas Maduro himself on narco-terrorism charges, offering a $15 million reward for information leading to his arrest. This was an extraordinary step, indicting a sitting head of state. Other senior Venezuelan officials were also indicted. The message was clear. The United States viewed the Venezuelan government not just as authoritarian or incompetent, but as actively criminal, as a threat to American security through its alleged facilitation of drug trafficking. Let's talk about the military dimensions more specifically, because the U.S. military has had to adapt to the challenges posed by Venezuela's crisis. Southern Command, the unified combatant command responsible for Central and South America, has identified Venezuela as a top concern in the region. The admiral or general leading Southcom regularly testifies to Congress about the threats emanating from Venezuela: drug trafficking, transnational criminal organizations, the presence of extra-hemispheric actors like Russia and China, and the general instability that could spill across borders. U.S. military assets have been deployed to the Caribbean to counter drug trafficking from Venezuela and to monitor the situation. Naval vessels, Coast Guard cutters, surveillance aircraft, and special operations forces have all played roles. There have been interdictions of drug shipments, intelligence gathering operations, and coordination with partner nations like Colombia and Brazil. The U.S. military hasn't intervened directly in Venezuela, but it has been actively working to contain the crisis's effects. There were moments when military intervention seemed possible. In 2019, when the Venezuelan opposition leader, Juan Guaidó, declared himself interim president and was recognized by the United States and dozens of other nations, there was speculation about potential U.S. military action to remove Maduro. President Trump himself said that he wouldn't rule out a military option. National Security Advisor John Bolton appeared at a press conference with a notepad that cameras caught, with 5,000 troops to Colombia written on it, sparking intense speculation. But military intervention never happened, and there are good reasons why. Venezuela is not Iraq or Afghanistan. It's a large country with nearly 30 million people, difficult terrain including mountains and jungles, and a military that, while demoralized and corrupt, still has significant hardware and personnel. Any U.S. military action would likely face resistance not just from Venezuelan forces, but potentially from Cuban, Russian, and other advisors. The risk of casualties would be high. The risk of turning Maduro into a martyr and unifying Venezuelans against American intervention would be real. Moreover, Latin American countries, even those that oppose Maduro, generally oppose U.S. military intervention in the region. There's a deep historical sensitivity about American military action in Latin America, going back to numerous interventions in the 20th century. Countries like Colombia, Brazil, and others have made clear they don't want to see U.S. troops invading Venezuela. For the United States to act unilaterally would damage relationships across the region and potentially create more problems than it solved. So the U.S. strategy has been one of maximum pressure without military force. Sanctions to cut off Maduro's revenue. Diplomatic isolation, rallying other countries to recognize Guaidó or withdraw recognition from Maduro. Support for humanitarian efforts to help Venezuelan refugees in neighboring countries. Intelligence sharing with partners. and a constant rhetorical campaign to delegitimize the Maduro regime and support democratic forces inside Venezuela. Now let's turn to Canada, because while Canada's response has been different in some ways, the country has also been significantly affected by Venezuela's crisis. Canada has a long history of mining investment in Latin America, and Canadian companies had substantial operations in Venezuela. As the crisis deepened, these investments were threatened, nationalized, or effectively confiscated. Canadian citizens working in Venezuela faced risks. Some were detained on dubious charges, effectively held hostage by a regime seeking leverage. Canada's Venezuelan diaspora community has grown substantially. Cities like Toronto, Montreal, and Calgary have seen an influx of Venezuelan professionals and families. Unlike the United States, Canada's immigration system allowed many Venezuelans to enter as skilled workers or through refugee programs. These communities have become politically active, pressuring the Canadian government to take stronger stances against Maduro. From a diplomatic perspective, Canada joined the Lima Group, a coalition of Western Hemisphere nations working to address the Venezuela crisis. Canada hosted meetings, imposed its own sanctions on Venezuelan officials, and recognized Juan Guaidó as interim president alongside the United States. This was notable because Canada doesn't always align completely with U.S. foreign policy in Latin America, but on Venezuela, there was rare consensus. The strategic implications for Canada also involve concerns about Chinese and Russian influence in the hemisphere. Canada, like the United States, has watched with concern as Beijing and Moscow have expanded their presence in Latin America. Venezuela has been a key entry point for this influence, and Canadian defense and intelligence officials recognize that instability in the region can have broader implications for North American security. One of the most profound impacts of Venezuela's crisis on both the United States and Canada has been the human stories, the individual tragedies that statistics can't capture. Let me tell you about what this has meant in human terms. Imagine being a doctor in Caracas, trained for years, dedicated to helping people. Suddenly your hospital has no medicine, no equipment, no electricity. You can't treat patients. You can't save lives. You watch people die from conditions that should be easily treatable. Your salary, even if it's paid, is worthless because of hyperinflation. You can't feed your family. You have no choice but to leave everything behind and flee. Tens of thousands of Venezuelan doctors, nurses, and healthcare professionals have left the country. Many ended up in the United States or Canada, but their Venezuelan medical credentials often aren't recognized. So you have surgeons driving Ubers, pediatricians working in restaurants, specialists forced to start over from scratch. It's a brain drain of catastrophic proportions for Venezuela and a complex challenge for receiving countries trying to integrate these skilled professionals. Or consider the children. Hundreds of thousands of Venezuelan children have crossed into the United States, many separated from parents, some entirely alone. They've experienced trauma that child psychologists say can have lifelong effects. They've missed years of schooling. They've known hunger, danger, uncertainty. American school systems, already challenged, have had to absorb these children, provide them with education, deal with language barriers, address trauma. Teachers in border states and major cities have found themselves on the front lines of a humanitarian crisis they never trained for. The stories of the journey north are harrowing. Venezuelans walking thousands of miles through the Darien Gap, a stretch of jungle between Colombia and Panama that's one of the most dangerous migration routes in the world. There are no roads, only jungle filled with snakes, jaguars, bandits, and treacherous rivers. People die there. Children die there. But for many Venezuelans, it seemed like the only option, the only path to safety and a future. In the United States, detention facilities near the border became overwhelmed. Images of crowded facilities, of families separated, of children behind chain-link fences sparked national debates about immigration policy and humanitarian obligations. Venezuela's crisis contributed directly to these scenes, adding complexity to an already difficult situation. Let's discuss the geopolitical chess game that Venezuela's crisis has become, because it's not just about Venezuela anymore. It's become a proxy battleground for larger global competitions. The United States sees Venezuela as a test case for the Monroe Doctrine, the long-standing American policy asserting that the Western Hemisphere is primarily within the U.S. sphere of influence. Russian and Chinese involvement in Venezuela challenges this doctrine directly. It's Moscow and Beijing saying, "Your backyard isn't exclusively yours anymore." Russia's Putin has made clear that supporting Maduro is about more than Venezuela. It's about showing that Russia is a global power that can project influence anywhere, even in the Caribbean. It's about thumbing his nose at American dominance. When Russian bombers land in Venezuela, or when Russian military advisors help Venezuelan forces, it's a message to Washington. You push NATO to our borders, we'll push into your neighborhood. China's approach is more subtle, but potentially more lasting. Beijing doesn't send bombers or talk about military intervention. Instead, it provides loans, investments, and economic lifelines. Over time, this creates dependence. Venezuela owes China tens of billions of dollars, debt that's secured against oil shipments. Even if Maduro falls and a democratic government takes over, that debt remains. China will expect to be paid, which means future Venezuelan oil flowing to China, Chinese influence over Venezuelan economic policy, Chinese companies maintaining their access to Venezuelan resources. For American strategists, this is deeply concerning. The Western Hemisphere has been relatively free of great power competition since the Cold War ended. Yes, there were challenges in places like Cuba or Nicaragua, but nothing like what we're seeing now with Venezuela. The concern is that if China and Russia succeed in maintaining a client state in Venezuela, other countries in the region might see this as a viable alternative to alignment with the United States. Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Peru, these countries all have their own interests and don't always align with Washington. If they see that China can provide investment without the political conditions that often come with Western aid, they might diversify their partnerships. The United States has tried to counter this through initiatives like America CREASE and increased engagement with Latin American partners. The argument to countries in the region is that Chinese investment comes with strings, that Chinese loans create debt traps, that Russian military equipment is inferior and comes with dependence on Moscow. The U.S. offers partnership based on democratic values, respect for sovereignty, and mutual interest. But this is a harder sell when American attention is often focused elsewhere, on the Middle East or Asia, while China is writing checks and Russia is delivering weapons. Let's talk about the economic costs of Venezuela's crisis for the United States and Canada, because beyond the strategic concerns, there are real financial impacts. The United States has spent billions of dollars on border security, immigration processing, detention facilities, and humanitarian aid related to the Venezuelan exodus. States like Texas, Florida, and New York have borne significant costs providing services to Venezuelan arrivals. Cities have had to expand shelter capacity, healthcare services, and educational resources. There's also the opportunity cost. Venezuela should be a major trading partner for the United States. In better times, American companies did significant business there. Now that trade has collapsed, American oil companies that once had operations in Venezuela have been shut out. The potential for billions in trade and investment sits unrealized because of Venezuela's chaos and the sanctions in place. For Canada, the impact has been similar if smaller in scale. Canadian mining companies have lost investments. Trade that should exist doesn't. And like the United States, Canada has spent resources on accepting and integrating Venezuelan refugees, costs that are necessary from a humanitarian perspective but still real. On the flip side, some argue that there have been economic benefits. Venezuelan professionals who arrived in North America have contributed to the economy, starting businesses, filling labor shortages, bringing skills and education. The Venezuelan diaspora in Miami has become a significant economic and cultural force. In Canada, Venezuelan immigrants have integrated into the tech sector, healthcare, and other industries. So while there are costs, there are also contributions. The question of what happens next in Venezuela is crucial for both the United States and Canada. Will Maduro remain in power indefinitely? Will there be a transition to democracy? Could the crisis get even worse? These questions keep policymakers in Washington and Ottawa awake at night because the answers have profound implications. There have been multiple attempts at negotiation between the Maduro regime and the opposition. Talks in Norway, talks in Mexico, always with the same pattern. Initial optimism, some agreements on paper, then implementation fails and things return to stalemate. Maduro has proven adept at using negotiations to buy time, to appear reasonable internationally, while never actually giving up power. The opposition has been fractured. Juan Guaidó, once recognized by over 50 countries as Venezuela's legitimate president, saw his support erode over time. He couldn't deliver on promises to restore democracy. He couldn't command the loyalty of the military. Eventually, even the opposition coalition that backed him splintered. This has been a source of frustration in Washington and Ottawa. How do you support Venezuelan democracy when the democratic opposition can't unite? Meanwhile, inside Venezuela, people continue to suffer. The humanitarian crisis hasn't ended. In some ways, it's stabilized at a horrific new normal. People survive through remittances sent from relatives abroad, through black market currency exchange, through sheer resilience. The economy has partially dollarized, with US dollars circulating alongside worthless bolivars. This has created a strange two-tier system where those with access to dollars can live somewhat normally, while those without remain in desperate poverty. The military remains key to Venezuela's future. If the armed forces withdrew support from Maduro, his regime would likely collapse within days. But the military leadership has been co-opted, enriched through corruption, and implicated in crimes that make them fear prosecution if Maduro falls. Senior generals control drug trafficking routes, siphon off state resources, and live in luxury while soldiers go hungry. They have everything to lose from change, and have so far remained loyal to Maduro despite increasing international pressure. The United States has tried to peel away military support through a combination of sanctions targeting specific officers and promises of amnesty for those who break with Maduro. Some mid-level officers have defected, but the top brass has held firm. This is the dilemma. Without military defection, Maduro stays. But the military won't defect without assurances about their future, and giving amnesty to people accused of crimes including drug trafficking and human rights abuses is politically and morally difficult. Let me talk about the broader implications for US military doctrine and hemispheric security strategy. Venezuela's crisis has forced a reassessment of how the United States approaches security in its own neighborhood. For decades after the Cold War, Latin America was frankly not a top priority for US military planners. The threats seemed manageable. Drug trafficking was the main concern, but even that was addressed more through law enforcement than military means. Venezuela changed that calculation. Suddenly there's a hostile government in South America aligned with US adversaries. There's a massive refugee crisis causing instability across the region. There's drug trafficking on a scale that threatens American communities. There's the potential for terrorist groups to exploit the chaos. US Southern Command has seen its responsibilities grow more complex and its resources stretched. The US military has had to think about scenarios it hoped never to face. What if Venezuela's collapse leads to a complete breakdown of order, a Somalia-style failed state in South America? What if fighting breaks out between Venezuela and Colombia or Brazil? What if terrorist groups establish safe havens in ungoverned Venezuelan territory? What's the American response if China decides to establish a military base in Venezuela, something that seems far-fetched but isn't impossible? These aren't academic exercises. War games and planning scenarios are being run. Contingency plans exist. The hope is they never need to be implemented, but the possibility that they might be is real enough that serious people take it seriously. Canada faces similar strategic questions, though from a different position. Canada doesn't have the military capacity for large-scale intervention, but it is part of North American defense through NORAD and has commitments through the Rio Treaty, the Inter-American Defense Pact. If a major crisis erupts in Venezuela that threatens hemispheric security, Canada would face difficult decisions about how and whether to support allied responses. There's also the intelligence dimension. Venezuelan intelligence services, aided by Cuban and Russian advisors, have been active in ways that concern Western intelligence agencies. There have been reports of Venezuelan spies operating in the United States and Canada, gathering information on exile communities, potentially identifying dissidents for targeting back home. Counterintelligence services have had to allocate resources to monitoring these activities. The cyber dimension shouldn't be ignored either. Venezuela, with Russian and Chinese assistance, has developed cyber capabilities. There have been attacks on opposition websites, journalists, and civil society organizations. The concern is that these capabilities could be turned outward, targeting critical infrastructure or institutions in neighboring countries, including the United States and Canada. Let's discuss the legal and ethical dimensions of how the United States and Canada have responded to Venezuela's crisis. There are serious questions about whether sanctions, while well-intentioned, have made the situation worse for ordinary Venezuelans. Critics argue that by crippling Venezuela's oil industry and economy, sanctions have increased suffering among the very people they're supposed to help. They point out that authoritarian regimes rarely fall because of economic pressure. Instead, they become more repressive and blame outsiders for problems. Defenders of sanctions argue that the alternative is to let Maduro use oil revenues to entrench his dictatorship, to buy weapons to fund repression. They argue that without pressure, there's no incentive for change. They note that the economic collapse began before the harshest sanctions were imposed, that Maduro's mismanagement is the root cause of Venezuela's problems. It's a legitimate debate with no easy answers. What's clear is that sanctions haven't achieved their primary goal of removing Maduro from power. They have imposed costs on the regime, but those costs have been bearable, especially with support from China, Russia, and Iran. Meanwhile, millions of Venezuelans have suffered, though disentangling how much of that suffering is due to sanctions versus mismanagement is nearly impossible. There are also questions about recognition. Was it right for the United States and Canada to recognize Juan Guaidó as interim president? On one hand, there were legitimate constitutional arguments that Maduro's re-election was fraudulent and that Guaidó, as president of the National Assembly, was next in line. On the other hand, recognition didn't change facts on the ground. Maduro still controlled the military, the territory, the state apparatus. Some argued that recognition painted the US and Canada into a corner, making it harder to engage with the de facto government when pragmatic engagement might have been necessary. The asylum system has faced ethical challenges too. How should the United States and Canada treat Venezuelan asylum seekers? There's a strong humanitarian case for offering protection to people fleeing persecution and chaos. But immigration systems have limited capacity, and large-scale asylum grants can create perceptions of unfairness, especially when people from other countries face tougher standards. The US and Canada have tried various approaches, from temporary protected status to specific asylum procedures, but no approach has been perfect. Let me paint a picture of what this means at the human level in North America. In Miami, entire neighborhoods have become Venezuelan. Restaurants serving arepas and pabellon criollo have opened. Venezuelan professionals network, support each other, send money back home. But there's also pain. Families are separated, some members in Venezuela, others scattered across the continent. People who had middle-class lives now struggle to make rent. Children adapt to new schools in a new language while their parents grieve for everything lost. In New York, a Venezuelan engineer works as a delivery person, riding a bike through all weather because his degree isn't recognized and starting over would take years and money he doesn't have. He's grateful to be safe, to be in a country with functioning institutions, but the loss of identity and purpose weighs on him. At night, he watches news from Venezuela on his phone, hoping for change, fearing the worst. In Texas, Border Patrol agents encounter Venezuelan families daily. They're doing their jobs, enforcing the law, but many agents admit privately that these aren't typical migrants. These are desperate people, often educated, who've lost everything. The agents see the children, hear the stories, and struggle with the human dimension of their work. It's easier when it's clear-cut. This is muddy, morally complex, emotionally draining. In Toronto, a Venezuelan doctor has spent 2 years re-qualifying, studying for exams she already passed once back home, working part-time jobs to survive while she does. The Canadian system is fair but demanding. She'll eventually practice medicine again, but the years lost hurt. Her children have adapted better than she has, their English now fluent, their Venezuelan accents fading. She's proud of them, but also sad that they're losing connection to the culture and country she loved. These stories multiply by hundreds of thousands. Each one is unique, but together they represent a mass trauma, a generation of Venezuelans displaced, a diaspora created by catastrophe. For the United States and Canada, this is both a challenge and a responsibility. These are people who've come seeking safety, who often contribute greatly to their new homes, but who also need support, understanding, and integration. Looking forward, what does the future hold? There are several possible scenarios, each with different implications for the United States and Canada. One possibility is that Maduro remains in power indefinitely. Venezuela continues as a failed state propped up by external actors, and the crisis becomes a permanent feature of the hemispheric landscape. This is the slow burn scenario, where nothing gets dramatically worse, but nothing gets better either. It means continued refugee flows, continued security challenges, continued geopolitical competition over Venezuela's corpse. Another scenario is sudden collapse. The military finally turns on Maduro, Perhaps because they calculate that the costs of loyalty exceed the benefits. Or Maduro dies, he's in his 60s and reportedly not in the best health, and there's no clear successor who can hold the regime together. Suddenly Venezuela is in chaos, potentially violent chaos. This scenario could require international intervention, humanitarian assistance on a massive scale, and careful management to prevent the collapse from spreading instability across borders. A third possibility is negotiated transition. Perhaps external pressure finally works. Perhaps Maduro is offered a comfortable exile, amnesty for some crimes, in exchange for stepping down. A transition government takes over, works with the opposition, and begins the long process of rebuilding. This is the optimistic scenario, but it requires Maduro to accept that his time is up and that he has a safe exit, neither of which seems likely right now. The United States and Canada are preparing for all these scenarios. Diplomats continue working on potential transition frameworks. Military planners have contingencies for humanitarian intervention if needed. Intelligence agencies monitor the situation for signs of imminent change. Aid agencies plan for potential mass return of refugees and the support that would require. It's a waiting game, frustrating in its uncertainty, critical in its implications. There's also the question of what Venezuela's restoration would require. Even if Maduro leaves tomorrow, the country faces staggering challenges. The economy is destroyed. Infrastructure has collapsed. Institutions are gutted. Corruption is endemic. Millions of Venezuelans live abroad and may not return. The technical expertise needed to run a modern oil industry has largely fled the country. It would take years, probably decades, and billions of dollars to rebuild Venezuela. Who would pay for that reconstruction? The United States and Canada would likely be asked to contribute, probably expected to lead international efforts. There are arguments for doing so. A stable, democratic, prosperous Venezuela would be in North American interests. It would eliminate the refugee flows, the security threats, the geopolitical complications. It would open opportunities for trade and investment. But convincing American and Canadian taxpayers to fund Venezuelan reconstruction, especially after years of crisis and frustration, would be politically difficult. International financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank would need to be involved. But Venezuela's debt situation is a nightmare. It owes billions to China, Russia, and various bondholders. Who gets paid first? How are competing claims sorted out? These are technical questions with huge political implications. And then there's the justice question. What happens to Maduro and the other officials accused of crimes? Does Venezuela pursue justice domestically? Is there an international tribunal? Are some crimes forgiven for the sake of peace and transition? South Africa had its Truth and Reconciliation Commission after apartheid. Other countries have taken different approaches. Whatever Venezuela chooses, it will be controversial and difficult. The United States has been clear that it wants to see accountability for crimes including drug trafficking, corruption, and human rights abuses. But the US has also shown pragmatism in the past, accepting negotiated transitions that involved amnesties if it served larger goals of stability and democracy. The tension between justice and peace would be real. For Canada, similar considerations apply, though Canada has sometimes taken a stronger stance on international justice than the United States. Canadian officials have spoken about referring Venezuelan officials to the International Criminal Court. But Canada also recognizes that perfect justice might be the enemy of achievable progress. Let me bring this back to what it all means for ordinary Americans and Canadians, because these geopolitical machinations have real effects on real lives. When gas prices spike, part of that is because millions of barrels of Venezuelan oil are off the market. When immigration becomes a polarizing political issue in US elections, Venezuela's refugee crisis is part of that story. When you hear about fentanyl and cocaine flowing into North American communities, some of that is moving through Venezuela's chaotic borders. The money spent on border security, on detention facilities, on humanitarian aid, that's taxpayer money, American and Canadian tax dollars going to address a crisis most people don't fully understand. The military resources deployed to counter threats from Venezuela, those are resources that could be used elsewhere. But there's another side too. The Venezuelan immigrants starting businesses, working in healthcare during the pandemic, contributing to communities, that's also part of the story. The cultural richness that immigrant communities bring, the restaurants and art and music, that's real too. The reminder that democracy and prosperity shouldn't be taken for granted. That's a lesson Venezuelans bring with them. And there's the moral dimension. Both the United States and Canada pride themselves on being places of refuge, countries that help people in need. Venezuela's crisis has tested those values. It's easy to support refugees in the abstract. It's harder when there are millions of them, when resources are stretched, when politics get nasty. But how North Americans respond to this crisis says something about who we are. I think about the American military personnel who've been deployed to the border or to counter-narcotics operations in the Caribbean. They didn't sign up expecting Venezuela to be a major part of their mission. They thought they might deploy to the Middle East or Afghanistan. Instead, they're dealing with a crisis in the Western Hemisphere, one that doesn't have clear military solutions. It's frustrating work, often thankless, but important. I think about the Canadian diplomats who've worked on the Venezuela file, attending Lima Group meetings, coordinating sanctions, trying to find paths toward resolution. Diplomacy can seem abstract, but these people are working to address real suffering, to prevent further catastrophe, to uphold principles of democracy and human rights. The fact that their work hasn't yet succeeded doesn't mean it hasn't mattered. The situation has also highlighted weaknesses in both American and Canadian approaches to Latin America. For too long, the region was neglected. Attention went to the Middle East, to Asia, to other priorities. Investments in diplomacy, development assistance, and partnership declined. Venezuela's crisis is partly a result of that neglect, of an assumption that the Western Hemisphere would always be stable, always friendly. That assumption has proven wrong. Both countries are now trying to reorient toward Latin America, recognizing that what happens there affects them directly. But rebuilding relationships, reestablishing presence, competing with China and Russia for influence, all of that takes time and resources and sustained attention. It's not clear that the political will exist for the long haul, especially given all the other crises and priorities competing for attention. Let me talk about some of the specific U.S. military operations and activities related to Venezuela that most people don't know about. Operation Martillo, for instance, is a joint operation involving U.S. military assets and partner nations to combat drug trafficking in Central American waters. Venezuelan drugs often transit through this region, and U.S. Navy ships and Coast Guard cutters interdict shipments. It's dangerous work, playing cat and mouse with traffickers on the open ocean. Special operations forces have been active in the region too, not in Venezuela itself, but in countries bordering it. They train partner forces, share intelligence, conduct surveillance. The goal is to contain the crisis, to prevent it from spreading, to disrupt the criminal networks that exploit Venezuela's chaos. There's been cooperation with Colombia, which has borne the brunt of the refugee crisis. Over 4 million Venezuelans have fled to Colombia, straining that country's resources and stability. The United States has provided hundreds of millions in aid to Colombia to help cope with this influx. There's also security cooperation, because the Colombia-Venezuela border has become a lawless area where guerrillas, paramilitaries, and criminals operate freely. Brazil has faced its own challenges with Venezuelans crossing the northern border. There were instances of violence against Venezuelan migrants, of communities overwhelmed by the sudden influx. Brazil, the regional giant, has been reluctant to take strong stances on Venezuela, preferring dialogue and non-intervention. This has sometimes put Brazil at odds with U.S. policy, creating friction. The U.S. has also worked with Caribbean nations, many of which have seen Venezuelans arrive by boat. Trinidad and Tobago, relatively close to Venezuela's coast, has had to deal with maritime arrivals. The U.S. Coast Guard and Navy have assisted with interdictions and with repatriating people in some cases, though this gets into complicated legal and humanitarian territory. There have been near misses and incidents that could have escalated. In 2019, there was a tense standoff when the U.S. and opposition tried to bring humanitarian aid into Venezuela through Colombia, and Maduro's forces blocked the border. Trucks were burned. People died. There was a real possibility of conflict. American military advisors were present in Colombia, and if fighting had broken out between Colombian and Venezuelan forces, the U.S. could have been drawn in. Then there was the bizarre incident in 2020, when a group of ex-Green Berets and Venezuelan exiles launched a comically incompetent maritime raid on Venezuela, trying to capture Maduro. They were quickly caught, and 2 Americans ended up in Venezuelan prisons. The U.S. government denied involvement, and it does seem like this was a rogue operation, but it highlighted the risks of uncontrolled escalation and the possibility of unauthorized military adventurism. The intelligence war has been intense. U.S. intelligence agencies have worked to understand the inner workings of Maduro's regime, to identify potential defectors, to track the movement of money and weapons. They've also monitored Russian and Chinese activities in Venezuela. It's a multidimensional intelligence challenge, requiring human sources, signals intelligence, satellite imagery, all the tools of modern espionage. Cuba's role in advising Venezuelan intelligence services has made this harder. Cuban intelligence is experienced, professional, and deeply suspicious of American capabilities. They've helped Venezuela root out potential spies, secure communications, and manage internal security. Breaking through that has been difficult. Cyber operations are also in play, though details are classified. It's reasonable to assume that the United States has conducted cyber activities against Venezuelan government systems, just as it's reasonable to assume Venezuela, with help from Russia and China, has probed American systems. This is the modern battlefield, invisible but consequential. Throughout all of this, there's been a constant debate in Washington and Ottawa about whether the current approach is working. Critics on the left argue that sanctions hurt innocent people and that engagement with Maduro, however distasteful, would be more productive. Critics on the right argue that the U.S. hasn't done enough, that more pressure or even military action is necessary. The centrist position, held by most policymakers, is that pressure must continue but military intervention is off the table and engagement is only possible if Maduro shows willingness to genuinely transition power. The domestic politics in both countries have been affected by Venezuela. In the United States, Venezuelan exiles in Florida have become a significant voting bloc. They tend to support hardline policies against Maduro and have influenced both Republican and Democratic politicians. The Trump administration's tough stance on Venezuela was partly driven by Florida politics. The Biden administration, despite wanting a different approach, has found it difficult to soften policies without angering this constituency. In Canada, the Venezuelan community is smaller and less politically concentrated, but they've still been active, organizing protests, lobbying the government, raising awareness. Canadian politicians have generally supported tough measures against Maduro, and there's been cross-party consensus on this, which is somewhat unusual in Canadian foreign policy. The Venezuela crisis has also become a talking point in debates about immigration policy more broadly. Opponents of liberal immigration policies point to the strain that Venezuelan arrivals have placed on systems. Supporters point to the humanitarian need and the contributions immigrants make. It's become entangled with larger arguments about borders, sovereignty, and national identity. As we near the end of this exploration, I want to reflect on what Venezuela's crisis reveals about the interconnected world we live in. A country collapses on one continent, and its effects ripple across an entire hemisphere. Energy markets shift. Migration routes form. Geopolitical competitions intensify. Military doctrines adjust. It's a reminder that in the 21st century, problems anywhere can become problems everywhere. For the United States and Canada, Venezuela has been a stark lesson that geography still matters. The Western Hemisphere is not immune to the instabilities that plague other regions. A failed state in South America creates challenges just as surely as one in the Middle East or Africa, maybe more so because of proximity. It's also a lesson about the limits of power. The United States is the world's most powerful nation, with the strongest military and economy. Yet it hasn't been able to solve the Venezuela crisis. Sanctions haven't worked. Diplomatic isolation hasn't worked. Support for the opposition hasn't worked. There's been no clean solution, no clear path to success. This is humbling and frustrating for a country accustomed to shaping outcomes. Canada has faced similar frustrations on a smaller scale. Canadian efforts, while well-intentioned and sometimes effective in specific ways, haven't changed the fundamental reality in Venezuela. This is the challenge of modern international affairs. Complex problems don't have simple solutions, and even sustained effort doesn't guarantee success. As I bring this to a close, I think about the Venezuelan people themselves. 7 million have fled, but 20 million or more remain. They wake up every day in a broken country, and they survive. They find ways to cope, to resist, to maintain dignity in the face of catastrophe. Their resilience is remarkable and humbling. Some of them still hope for change, for a better future. Others have resigned themselves to endurance. But they continue. Children still go to school when schools are open. Doctors still try to treat patients with no medicine. Teachers still teach with no supplies. People still fall in love, get married, have children, laugh with friends, even in the midst of crisis. Life continues even when systems collapse. For the United States and Canada, the Venezuela crisis is an ongoing challenge that won't be resolved quickly. It will likely be a feature of hemispheric affairs for years, maybe decades. The question is how North Americans respond, whether with wisdom and compassion or with frustration and indifference. The answer will say a lot about values, about priorities, about who we are as nations and peoples. Venezuela's crisis didn't stay in Venezuela. It reached across the Caribbean, moved through Central America, arrived at the Rio Grande and the Canadian border. It affected military planning and energy security. It changed politics and strained resources. It tested values and revealed limitations. In all these ways, Venezuela's nightmare became, to varying degrees, a North American concern. This is the reality of our interconnected world. We are bound together, for better and worse. What happens in Caracas matters in Washington and Ottawa. The suffering of Venezuelans demands response from Americans and Canadians. Not because of strategy or interests alone, though those matter, but because of shared humanity, because indifference to such catastrophe diminishes us all. So the crisis continues. The challenges remain. And the search for solutions, imperfect and frustrating as it is, must also continue. Because the alternative, accepting that millions suffer while we look away, is simply unacceptable. That's the real test Venezuela poses to the United States and Canada, not just of policy but of character.